How German is the US? Many people don't know that Germans actually make up the largest ancestry group of the country, even before the Irish and the English. In the 19th century alone, it was over 5 million German immigrants who came over to America to start a new life. And they left a lot of traces, many of which are not very well known. Did you know, for example, that the famous Brooklyn Bridge in New York was designed by German engineer John Roebling, or that it was a German artist who designed the modern rendition of Santa Claus? And even the capital of the US, Washington, D.C., was heavily influenced by German immigrants, all the way down to the city layout. That's why, in collaboration with the German embassy, I'm in D.C. today to uncover its German roots. So I'm looking for the German roots of Washington, D.C. But where should I start? All I see are American government buildings, these big monuments, memorials of important parts of American history, and one museum after another. But what if the German connections are closer than I think? What if I'm not seeing the forest for the trees? Well, lucky for me that I got some help from a true expert. Katja Sippel is the executive director of the German American Heritage Foundation here in DC, and she grew up right around the corner from me in Bavaria with a German mom and a British dad. And thanks to her, I quickly find out that even right here, at the heart of the United States, the US Capitol building, German immigrants have left a mark.
Its roots go back to George Washington himself, so construction of this was an ongoing project, and as you can see, it still is. It's undergoing construction work right now. It took decades to complete this building. So the first phase was actually completed in the 1820s, and then as Washington grew, by the mid-19th century, the space had grown too small for the expanding country and its government.
So it was clear that the US Congress was in need for a bigger building. Architect Thomas Eustick Walter won the design competition for the project and became the fourth architect of the US Capitol. Walter was born in Philadelphia into a family of German descent. His grandfather had come to the US from Germany at the age of 6 as an orphan and ended up as a servant in Philadelphia before he was able to become a master bricklayer. To accommodate all of the senators and representatives of the growing country, Walter added a north wing for the Senate and a south wing for the House of Representatives to the Capitol building in the 1850s. Since the expansion made the existing copper dome in the center look unproportionally small, he ended up replacing it with a new cast iron dome in 1862, which to this day makes for the iconic look of the Capitol building as a symbol of the United States and its democratic system. Walter's chief assistant, August Schönborn, who had come over from the German region of Thuringia just a few years prior, was one of the main contributors on this project. He was born in the city of Suhl and later studied architecture in Erfurt. He left Germany during the European revolutions of 1848 and first settled in Wisconsin, but then moved to DC to work with Thomas Walter. Schönborn created the original drawings of the dome that were inspired by the Pantheon in Paris, St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. At the time, building a dome made of iron was a pretty innovative endeavor. Not only would it create a beautiful tall structure, it was also supposed to prevent the risk of fire after, in 1814, British troops had set large parts of the city on fire, including the Capitol and the White House.
They were both trained architects, by the way, and also engineers, which shows because a dome like this is not just difficult to conceive, it's also difficult to construct.
Of course,
and they came up with this beautiful dome structure that gives the Capitol its very distinct look.
And even when you go inside the Capitol, you'll see the work of a German artist.
The ceiling frescoes of the Capitol were in part done by Urban Geier. He was a very talented fresco painter, and he had come to Washington, D.C. because of the economic opportunity the expansion of this new capital city afforded.
Geier was from Königheim in Baden-Württemberg, and when he heard about the large renovation projects on the US Capitol, he decided to move his wife and his 5 kids to the New World. Once he arrived in DC, he was hired by the Italian fresco artist Costantino Bromidi, whom he helped create the fresco ceiling of room S211 in the Capitol, initially intended for the Senate Library.
So 3 German-American names that really marked this building, that made it what it is today.
Yeah. Weirdly enough, most people, even within the German-American community here, don't know about this.
I didn't even know about it until a week ago, which is really crazy.
So we found our first trace of German influence right in the center of DC. But where to look next? When it comes to immigrant communities and their history, one of the best places to look for information are churches, as going to church was an essential part of life for most Germans in the 18th and 19th century, and it was one of the first places where immigrants created a community in their new home. That's where they spent every Sunday, where they were baptized, married, and also where many of them got their education, since parishes often had their own schools as well. So we went to a church previously named St. Mary's German Catholic Church, now St. Mary Mother of God, located on 5th Street in today's neighborhood of Chinatown, and talked to the church's historian, Pat Lally.
So this church was founded as a parish in 1845 by the German community in Washington, which at that time was very small, about 20 families, and very new to the city.
The church constructions were completed in 1846, but the parish, whose members mainly came from German-speaking regions in the south, grew rapidly, so that only a few decades later, they had outgrown the church and built a bigger one, which is the one that still stands today. In the basement, you can still see the original foundations. Why does this remind me of National Treasure?
The original church was from these pillars to this wall, to the pillars beyond there. And then when it was expanded, it was expanded onto these walls and then all the way back there. And again,
So was it relatively small in the beginning then?
It was.
The first one?
It was. It was relatively small. By 1890, that small group of about 20 German families, by the time this church was built, had grown into 2,600 families.
That's insane. How did they even...
Families of no fewer than 8 people.
That's what I was going to say too.
No fewer than 8 people. I mean,
Yeah.
eight people would have been considered a standard number.
Right. Yeah,
So,
that's how
I mean,
it was.
you were talking about an enormous group of people.
How did they fit them into the church? Did they just
Multiple
all
masses.
go?
Multiple
Did they all go on Sunday and it was just mass, mass,
all
mass?
went on Sundays, 8 o'clock, 9:30,
Okay.
10:30, 12 o'clock.
Do you know if they were assigned a time slot or could they pick freely?
They could pick freely.
They just like
freely.
hope that hopefully not
They could
everyone
pick
shows up to
freely.
the same one.
They could pick freely. But knowing how much the Germans loved their music, I'm sure the mass that they all duked it out for was the high mass, which even today at this church is only sung.
In addition to the church itself, the parish also established a school as well as an orphanage. While the Mass was held in Latin at the time, the sermon and everything else were in German. The school that operated all the way until 1978, known as St. Mary's German School, was taught by the School Sisters of Notre Dame, Arme Schulschwestern von unserer lieben Frau in German, which is a religious institute founded in Bavaria. Walking through the church, you'll come across tons of German names in the stained glass windows that were made by the Glasmalerei Tirol in Austria, as well as wall plaques dedicated to the pastors and important parishioners. Even though the parish still has a few members of German descent today, its German identity for the most part disappeared in the early 20th century with the rise of the so-called anti-German sentiment during World War I. Today, the German community in DC is barely visible, as Pat Lally describes.
In the national capital area, German assimilation at this point is such that it is very, very hard to identify someone by their German ethnocultural roots. Of all of the traditional Western European ethnic groups that you can still see manifest by ethnic clues in different cities in the United States, in Washington, D.C., that is not the case. There is only one, at least as it relates to Catholic ethnicity, Catholic parishes, there is only one parish in the city of Washington that is specifically identifiable by its ethnic clues or language, and that's the Italian parish.
Okay.
Polish parish in D.C.? No. German parish in D.C.? No. Irish parish in D.C.? No. There's such an assimilation that their cultural roots are only really identifiable by their surname.
In the 19th century, however, the German community was very visible in the city, especially here in the area that the church is located in, which used to be DC's German quarter. The neighborhood started here on 5th Street and stretched out all the way to 14th Street.
We're walking on 7th Street here, and 7th Street was the heart of DC's Little Germany.
Okay.
So this was a very lively district. 120, 130 years ago, this would have been the bustling center of DC's German district. Some of these buildings are original, and people lived and worked here. So it's kind of a similar vibe even today. You have restaurants, you have shops, and I don't think there are too many residential areas anymore, but you can tell that these houses were definitely built to give families a home as well.
So would the whole everyday life and the businesses, would that all take place in German at the time?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
So like you would see German business names
There
and
would be
things like
German
that?
business names. Their conversation in the streets would probably have been in German. When neighbors and business partners met, the language of interaction was German, and that made it attractive for new arrivals because they found an area where they could feel at home, they could put down their roots, and they
comforting.
Yes, it's comforting, exactly. And they were able to interact with people that shared the same heritage and the same culture and language. And that, of course, made integration that much easier. Unfortunately, none of these businesses exist anymore. It's now a very cosmopolitan mix, as befits a city like Washington, D.C. But 130 years ago, things would have been very different.
When did it stop being Little Germany? Was it World War I?
It was World War I, absolutely. The end of World War I also meant pretty much the end of Little Germany. People started moving away. They didn't want to be clustered in an area where it was so easy to be targeted. And as they became more prosperous, they also moved into other more affluent areas, especially in the Northwest, Georgetown, Kalorama, those neighborhoods.
What's interesting is that many of the Germans that came to DC had quite a different immigrant experience than other groups, such as the Irish, who also came to the US in big waves in the mid-19th century, but who didn't have a lot of education and mainly worked as farmers or were recruited for physical labor.
Unlike my own immigrant experience, which is from Ireland, where many of the immigrants came over as single men, the German experience, at least as it relates to this parish, many of the Germans immigrated with three things that are very distinct. They immigrated as families, they immigrated with a little bit of money, and they immigrated, again, unlike my own family's immigrant experience, they immigrated with trades. So as soon as they hit the beaches of Washington, so to speak, they immediately established themselves in a residence, they immediately established themselves in a lucrative trade. They were very entrepreneurial.
They were skilled craftsmen, artists, builders, inventors, entrepreneurs, bankers. There really wasn't a profession or a trade where they were not found. They were intellectuals, statesmen, politicians, diplomats, engineers.
Of course, yeah.
They were in all areas of life.
And they seem to have been particularly interested in integrating themselves into American society, more so than German immigrant communities in other places of the US, where they often didn't leave their German-speaking enclave for decades and didn't speak a lot of English.
I think that Germans were particularly interested in learning the language and being fluent English speakers and reflecting a fluency, if you will, in American culture. I do not think outside of their community they wanted to be perceived as being exclusively German. So I think that they were extremely interested in portraying themselves as integrated into American society, and of course that begins with English. So they're anglicizing their names. You know, Johann Muller becomes John Miller.
He was the stonemason who built the foundation of the original church building. And he did this way before the anti-German sentiments.
Oh, way before. Way before. He did it like in post-Civil War period. And so I'm sensing that Germans really want to outwardly express, not inwardly, but they definitely outwardly want to express this American identity.
And this isn't the only aspect that sets Washington apart from other popular immigrant hubs in the country, and from other US cities in general. From the beginning, DC was a completely planned city that was built on swampland specifically to become the national capital, and it wasn't founded until the year 1790. So in the 1800s, when a lot of the German immigrants arrived, it was still a very young city, and a seasonal one.
So it waxed and waned in population between the times that the Congress was sitting. So when Congress sat, Washington might have 25, 30,000 people. When Congress wasn't sitting, it might have 5,000 people. But definitely by the time the Civil War is occurring here, there are things that are happening in Washington that are appealing to Germans who are seeking economic opportunity. Early Washington, not so much.
Okay.
But Civil War and certainly post-Civil War Washington is a tremendous place in the United States for economic opportunity because the city is starting to establish itself as a permanent, not a seasonal city. And what's happening in the very late 1850s is the United States Capitol is being expanded from the small federal period Capitol to the building that we see today, which is triple in size of the original building. And one of the things that attracted some of the Germans to this parish from Germany was not only its proximity to the capital, but the job opportunities for craftspeople. Germans were known for their training in the arts, in the fine arts. And Constantino Brumidi, who was the primary fresco artist of the US Capitol for 25 years, really looked for two ethnic communities to receive help in executing some of the fine arts, particularly the fresco work in the Capitol. That was the German community and the Italian community.
One of those Germans was Urban Geier, a name that we're already familiar with because he helped Brumidi paint the frescoes in the Capitol building. He was a prominent parishioner here at St. Mary's Church. There's even a stained glass window dedicated to him. Geier is one of many Germans that left a mark in American history. Last year, the German American Heritage Foundation published a whole book about influential German personalities titled How German Ingenuity Inspired America. More fun, more beauty, more freedom. It's a beautiful coffee table book, a great addition for your bookshelf, and the perfect Christmas gift. You can check it out and order it through the link in the info box below.
We're right in front of a poster here that pays tribute to the history of Hollywood. And Hollywood was founded mostly by Austrian and German immigrants.
This included film producers like Karl Laemmle, co-founder of Universal Studios, directors like Ernst Lubitsch, as well as actors and actresses such as Marlene Dietrich. Also music composers like Max Steiner from Austria, who made the score for Gone with the Wind. Or, looking at modern-day Hollywood, Hans Zimmer. And, fitting for the season, there's a whole section on Christmas traditions.
Thomas Nast created the modern image of Santa Claus with the white beard and the red coat and the fur-lined hat. That was based on a mix of St. Nicholas and Father Christmas.
Yeah,
white
when is this from?
beard.
1863?
Yes.
This pretty much looks like Santa still looks today.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's pretty much the same.
The only difference, and this is where you can tell the Father Christmas influence, in my opinion,
I see, yeah.
is the holly.
Yeah. He doesn't have the hat.
Yes,
Yeah.
there is no hat. And if you look at old 19th century drawings of the English Father Christmas, he has either a laurel or a holly wreath, sometimes even a mix of both.
So, Santa Claus was not an invention of Coca-Cola.
Nope. Nope. Santa Claus predates Coca-Cola, but they did make him popular.
Yeah.
Never hurts. The Christmas tree, of course.
Very important.
Very important. You cannot imagine Christmas without a decorated evergreen tree, even if it's often made of plastic these days.
Not so much in Germany, but...
No, that's true. No plastic tree from my house either. But the Christmas tree came to the US, to Pennsylvania, in the 17th century, and then sort of fell out of favor. And Queen Victoria, who was a German too, and her German-born husband decorated the palace with a Christmas tree, and drawings were sent all over the world. And when Americans saw that, they were like, oh my goodness, we need a Christmas tree.
Germans also heavily influenced the fashion world when Levi Strauss, who had immigrated from Buttenheim in Franconia, invented the blue jeans in the 1870s. And they played a big role in space travel. Aerospace engineer Werner von Braun, whose Nazi past wasn't very well known at the time yet, helped make the American moon landing possible. Another German who significantly influenced American history was Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben, who, to this day, is considered one of the most important figures of the Revolutionary War. That's why many American cities celebrate the von Steuben Day every year in September. New York even hosts a huge annual parade in his honor, and there are countless memorials for him all over the country. One of them is here in Washington at Lafayette Square, designed by German immigrant Albert Jägers in 1910.
Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben was a Prussian military officer. He was already a very accomplished man by the time he came to the US in 1775, and it was through French diplomatic connections and the aid of Jefferson that he arrived here. When he came here, it was obviously just right before the outbreak of the War of Independence.
And good timing.
Yes, his timing was perfect. He didn't really have many prospects in Europe at the time because there was a period of peace, which is of course not really great for a military man. So when he came here, he was kind of immediately thrown into this situation with a young country that had just declared its independence and a completely untrained army. The Continental Army consisted of volunteers, people who for the most part had no or at the most very, very little military experience.
Right.
And they were quite a ragtag bunch, and he was appalled. He was truly aghast when he saw this Continental Army, and he realized that they would not be able to win against the British, who were, the premier military power at the time.
Yeah.
So
they needed his help.
They needed his help. He implemented a drill regimen and instructed them in tactics and military strategy.
And the Prussian military was known for being very strict and disciplined.
Yes,
Yeah.
and he had learned from the best. He became a cadet at age 14. He came from a military family. He served under the Prussian King Frederick the Great. So he really had that knowledge. And it's no exaggeration to say that it was through him, his knowledge, his instructions, that the United States could declare independence and actually maintain an independent country, defeat the British, kick them out of the country, and continue to exist as an independent nation. Had it not been for him, there would be no United States of America, or not at that time.
Yep. While a German was a hero of one war, it was another war that led to some of the toughest times for German immigrants in the United States, the so-called anti-German sentiment that rose within American society during World War I, particularly with the US joining the war in 1917. German-born immigrants, as well as their American-born descendants, were facing harsh discrimination. This included the German language being banned in many places, German-sounding streets and businesses being renamed, and a lot of people were even deported, such as the pastor of St. Mary's Church at the time, Reverend Roth.
Unfortunately, in 1918, during World War I, anti-German sentiment really hurt this parish tremendously, and it was very much reflected in him. He was an unnaturalized German citizen, and according to US law, he had to be deported. So our pastor was deported during World War I.
The German immigrant community and the German American community really suffered as a result.
Yes.
Their schools were closed down. Services were no longer held in the German language. German newspapers were shut down. German books weren't well received. There were actually book burnings.
Yeah.
And that's really something that we associate with a different and very dark era.
Yeah, where the Germans were the
yes, exactly,
the evil.
Exactly. Nazi Germany, there were book burnings. We know that they destroyed art.
Really suffered throughout World War I. They got as bad as lynching people.
Yes.
And of course, taking away their businesses, kicking them out, banning their societies, really taking everything from them.
I don't know that we had lynchings here in DC. At least I haven't heard of it, but I know that shops were attacked. The owners were not physically attacked as far as we can tell, but their property was damaged. That's of course bad enough. And that again explains why people didn't really want to remain living in an ethnic enclave, because they were very much a target. You know, being clustered together in a relatively small geographic area makes you very vulnerable to attack, because everybody knew that this was the German quarter of DC. It wasn't a secret. That's the way it had been for decades. So everybody knew this is where the Germans live. And those who could afford it, and the Germans were prosperous, they quickly decided that it was better for their own safety to move away, to disperse, and to blend in to other areas. And, you know, in many ways they were lucky, because being Europeans, they had the ability to blend in. They were able to physically fit in with the mainstream society. And if they anglicized their names, as many did, it wasn't immediately apparent that they had their roots in Germany.
So they're trying hard to combat that anti-German sentiment by sending their boys to fight in the war, by publicly advertising war bonds, by becoming public and very visible members of the fundraising movement for the First World War effort.
Fortunately, after World War I and World War II were over, the US and the new Federal Republic of Germany were able to re-establish their friendship, and in 1983, the US even proclaimed October 6th German American Day, in honor of the founding of the first permanent German settlement in the US 300 years prior in 1683, Germantown, Pennsylvania, originally named Germanopolis by the Germans. In addition to that, they opened the German-American Friendship Garden in Washington, D.C. a few years later, that was opened in the fall of 1988, dedicated by German Chancellor Helmut Kohl and U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who had signed the proclamation for the garden. It has such a prime location. Like, there's the monument right there.
Exactly.
It's part of the mall, which, I mean, every German knows, or I think pretty much everyone all over the world knows. And so close to the White House, that's really a amazing location.
This last German American Day, last month, we actually had a flyover by President Biden. So the presidential helicopters were flying right above us, and we waved up and said, "Oh, there are first visitors." And
awesome.
this was a special greeting from the White House on behalf of German American Day.
The garden features a variety of beautiful trees, flowers, and other plants that are native to each of the two countries, as well as benches and 2 water fountains, and was designed pro bono by German landscape architect Wolfgang Oehme. The garden underwent big renovations over the last few years and was just reopened in April 2022. However, despite its prominent location, not a lot of people know of its existence, both Americans and Germans.
When Germans come to the city, and the National Mall, of course, is a well-known tourist attraction.
Of course,
they see this and they're like, what? Wait a second, there's a German-American friendship garden?
Like, what, we're represented here?
Yes, and such a prominent place right across from the White House. Why did we not know this?
That's amazing.
And I always like to call this one of Washington's best kept secrets. This garden has been around for close to 35 years now, and it's still a very well-kept secret. And that's actually kind of a shame. So.
I wonder why. We should promote that a little bit more in Germany.
I
All the Germans
agree.
watching, there's a German-American Friendship Garden in Washington, D.C. If you ever come here and visit, you should definitely check it out.
Yes, absolutely. And Germany is the only country that has such a garden.
Oh, really?
Yes. There's no other country that has, there's no English American or nor British American nor a, I don't know,
Italian,
Mexican American or Italian American friendship garden. This is it.
That's amazing. But as it turned out, at least among German government representatives, the garden is a popular destination. And it just so happened that we ran into German Bundestagsmember, Member of Parliament Bettina Luke, who was getting a tour from members of the German embassy. But back to the search for the German roots of Washington. Even though a lot of documents are kept in decentralized church and synagogue archives, and a lot of information was destroyed due to several fires, book burnings, and discrimination, there are still a lot of artifacts to find in countless museums and organizations all over the country. One of them being the Museum of the German American Heritage Foundation. The foundation was founded in 1977, the museum space opened in 2010, and is located on 6th Street in the heart of the former German Quarter.
This building was a private residence at one point. It was created in the 1880s and it served as the private residence for John and Caroline Hockemeyer. Both of them were immigrants from Germany, from Baden-Württemberg. He was a merchant, she was a housewife. They didn't have children, but they were quite well-to-do, so they built this townhouse, and he was also very, very involved in German societies at the time. So he added a 2-story annex. This back here was a separate building, and he called this the meeting hall. It had a separate entrance from the back alley, and he would also rent this out so people could hold events here, you know, weddings, parties, and apparently people weren't all that different back then from what they are now. There were quite a few complaints from the neighbors about the scantily clad ladies that emerged from the building, and the noise, the noise too. But the Hockemeyers were very well integrated in not just the German-American community, but the wider Washington society. He was a Civil War veteran. He had fought for the Union. But anyway, the foundation bought this building, saved it from demolition together with the DC Preservation Society, and decided to turn it into its headquarters and a museum.
The museum chronicles the history of immigration from German-speaking countries to places all over the US. Their permanent exhibition features fascinating artifacts like this china set that was used on the transatlantic steamer SS Europa in the 1930s and was made by the royal porcelain manufacturer Nymphenburg in Munich. Or you can find marriage certificates from Philadelphia that were completely in German, letters and poetry albums of a German immigrant, or this German translation of the Declaration of Independence that a German-speaking newspaper had published on July 9th, 1776, only 5 days after the declaration was first signed.
So German was the first foreign language translation of the Declaration of Independence. And that's pretty neat.
This trophy is from one of the massive Sängerfeste, singing competitions, that the German singing clubs organized at the time, and still do today. This one from 1910 was won by the Pacific Sängerbund at a competition in San Francisco, and it was donated by none other than the Austrian Emperor Franz Josef I, and somehow found its way to the museum. And if you thought that's a big trophy for a singing competition, you haven't seen this one yet. History isn't always just about preservation, though. Proactive research and uncovering unknown details are just as relevant. This model that was built in 2018 and donated to the museum in 2020 reveals a part of German-American history that most people, including myself, have never heard of before.
This was the Crystal City Family Internment Camp in Crystal City, Texas.
Katja tells me that the model was created by Arthur Jacobs, an American born to German parents whose family was incarcerated at this camp when he was a child.
Even though he and his brother were native-born Americans, they were put in this camp in Texas. Then he and his parents and brother were deported to Germany, and this was right after the end of the Second World War. So you can imagine what it was like. Devastation everywhere, shortage of food, of everything. And he didn't understand why his country would do that to him, because he saw himself as an American, and that's what he was for all intents and purposes. And yet here the US government sent him to a country that he didn't even know except from tales of his parents. And his German wasn't even particularly good. And he ended up writing a book about his experience, and he also had this model built because he wanted this story to get out. And we surrounded the model with some pictures, including an aerial shot of the Crystal City camp, just so you can see the sheer size of this. And it really was a self-contained city. Everything necessary for daily life was contained within that compound. Schools, medical facilities, there was a swimming pool. So you could say in many ways that the people there didn't suffer, but at the same time they were imprisoned. They couldn't just leave. I'm delighted that there is finally a bill that's in the works right now to recognize what happened to these German-American internees during World War II.
By the way, if you'd like to support the American Heritage Foundation and Museum, or even get involved yourself, you can reach out to them on their website, and since they're a nonprofit organization, every donation makes an impact. As we've already discovered, a lot of the German influence can be found in architecture. And that doesn't stop with a single building, but goes way deeper than that.
Thomas Jefferson traveled to Germany. He served as an ambassador in France, and it is known that he crossed over the Rhine and actually visited the city of Karlsruhe. And he was so taken by that city, which was also a planned city, and at the time still rather young, not historically grown, but very much a planned city in a fan shape with the castle at the center and then all the streets fanning out in a diagonal shape, that he created drawings and he sent them back to Pierre L'Enfant, the master designer of the city of Washington, and said, here, take a look at this. I think this is the concept that you should use for our young nation's capital. So the southern German city of Karlsruhe actually inspired the plans for Washington, D.C.
Other architectural structures where you can find German traces include the National Archives building, where on the north facade you'll find this 1936 statue called Destiny by German immigrant Adolf Weinmann, again from Karlsruhe, but also the Eastern Market, which is an indoor market inspired by European farmers' markets located in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. It was built in 1873 by German architect Adolf Kloos from Heilbronn, who was friends with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and who, due to his communist sentiment and his favorite construction material, red brick, got the nickname Roter Architekt, Red Architect. To this day, the market is a local staple and offers everything from fresh produce, meat and fish, to delicious pastries, pasta, and international cheeses. But the building that probably has the most stories to tell is the Petersen House. And for that, we're headed back to the former German Quarter, because here on 10th Street is the place where President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on the night of April 14th, 1865, only 5 days after the end of the American Civil War. Ford's Theater. He was sitting in a private box with his wife and 2 friends, enjoying the play, when he was shot in the back of the head by John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and Confederate sympathizer who had planned the attack together with a small group of conspirators. A 23-year-old doctor who happened to be in the audience immediately took care of Lincoln, and together with some soldiers, they brought him into the residential house right across the street, which was owned by German tailor William Petersen, originally probably Wilhelm Petersen, and his wife Anna. Even though neither of the couple were home at the time of the incident, 3 of their kids, as well as several of their boarders, were there. One of them, Henry Safford, was reading in the front parlor when he heard the turmoil on the street and told them to bring the wounded president into the house, where they put him in the bed of another boarder that was out celebrating the end of the war that night. Oh, this is the room?
Yes, so this is the room where he died at 7:22 in the morning of April 15th, 1865.
That feels intimate. His wife Mary and their son Robert were by his side all night, together with several friends and fellow statesmen. Between visits to her husband's bedside, Mary Lincoln waited in this parlor with her son Robert and friends of the Lincoln family. So that's a pretty historic place. Okay, so it says that in this bedroom, Secretary of War Stanton held several cabinet meetings, interviewed with witnesses, and ordered the pursuit of the assassins. So I guess this became kind of part of the investigations here. By the way, there are rumors that Booth, the guy who killed Lincoln, had actually slept in the exact same bed a month prior when visiting his friend and fellow actor Charles Warwick, who was living at the Petersen House at the time. This isn't confirmed, but it would be a pretty crazy coincidence.
We briefly talked about Thomas Nast, the cartoonist and caricaturist who basically invented the image of Santa Claus as we know it today. Yeah. And Thomas Nast was an ardent supporter of the Union during the Civil War and a great admirer of Lincoln's. And he worked for Harper's Weekly, so many of his drawings were published by that magazine. And he did this very touching tribute in honor of Lincoln. This is interesting down here. So the 19th century was big on allegories, on allegorical figures, and this is Europe comforting her mourning sister, America. The two continents are depicted as women.
I like that. After the assassination, the Petersens went through some pretty difficult times. Not only did their tailoring business dry up, they also lost almost all of their boarders due to the amount of noisy visitors that constantly came by to see the room that the president had died in, and sometimes even went as far as cutting off pieces of the carpet and the wallpaper as a souvenir. After William and Anna Petersen passed away, their children sold the house to the family of German lawyer and newspaper editor Louis Schade from Berlin, who then sold it to the federal government 20 years later.
And then in the 1890s, it became a museum. And we were just talking about how the furniture was taken out during these early decades as a museum, and instead they just put in all these frames, tightly filling every little bit of space available on the wall with photographs and information, newspaper articles, maps, etc., everything they had available. This is where the bed is now placed again. And in the 1930s, the house was taken over by the National Park Service, and the National Park Service decided to bring back the furniture and to recreate the house in the style of a historic home museum, and that's what we have today.
So this is somewhat of a full circle moment, really, because we're standing in front of the house where one of the most important people in the history of the United States died, and one of the most important presidents and most popular presidents of the US. And he died in the house that belonged to a German immigrant that lived here in this neighborhood, which was a very German neighborhood at the time. And this is going to be where my journey for today ends. We've been able to uncover a lot of the German roots of Washington, D.C. Not everything, of course, there's still so much more to uncover, but that's going to be for another time. I'm sure I'm going to be back here. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. For more information on the German Embassy and the German American Heritage Foundation and Museum, all the information is down below in the info box. And if you like my content, make sure that you're subscribed to my channel. All of my social media channels are over here. And of course, if you haven't seen last year's video yet, where I was looking for the German roots in Chicago, you can watch that right over here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope I'll see you next time. Tschüss!